Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our show, which is Hanging the Shame Back. So this is dedicated to adult survivors of child sexual abuse, and my name is Gloria Masters. I'll be hosting this, and just for all our fellow survivors out there, especially in Aotearoa, New Zealand, this is a place for you to safely hand the shame back. Each week, I provide an interview with another survivor to help support us all in our journey of recovery and healing. If you feel triggered at all throughout this, please go to the show notes underneath and you'll be directed to options for support. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the show Ken Clearwater. And what I love about this man, and you guys will too, is that he's actually widely known as an activist for male survivors in Aotearoa. He's also a national advocate for male survivors in 2013. He still is, really. And currently he's voluntarily working with guys who are on the Commission of Inquiry with all the abuse that's happened in Marylands. So welcome to the show, Ken. It's actually a real honour to have you with me today.
Thanks, Gloria. It's a pleasure to be here. Anything to help fellow survivors is always a good platform. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think we're very lucky to have you supporting all our wonderful men out there who have gone through this trauma as well. And I think for our viewers out there, one of the things Ken and I were just talking on actually is normalising this conversation. I think what Ken and I both have come to is that it's a subject that people don't like to discuss. And Ken, interested in your views around that and why this is not a normalised conversation in New Zealand.
I think it's. I really think it's too hard for most people. It doesn't fit into their cognitive thinking, and so it's better. Like, you might read about it, and then you can throw that bit of paper away. But I don't think people want to know that it actually happens to children like it does, and I think that's the biggest problem. And it's about if we can normalise that just the conversation, not what happened, because I mean that's never going to be normal or accepted, but just that you can talk about it. And I know that when I first started this work 25 years ago, people didn't want to hear what I had to say, and especially in relation to male victims, because males are all perpetrators and females are victims. So to start bringing up about males being victims of sexual trauma, it was just, like I said, nobody wanted to talk about it. And I'd go to parties and you'd hear people say, "Oh, don't ask Ken what he does for a living," and things like that. But now it's especially younger people. I mean, like I got interviewed by the young reporters in the press. I think it was 2017 when we had our international conference here in Christchurch, and the young, both male and female reporters, they were just so interested in asking questions and saying, "Why don't we know about this stuff? Why isn't this talked about?" And so for me, knowing that the younger generation are not frightened to talk about that gives me hope.
It's fantastic. And you raised an interesting point. You know, when you think about there's a quite a disparity between male survivors and female survivors and acceptance by society for each. In the case of men, it sounds as though there's been a real inequity actually, and almost a double-edged sword, because they're men, so that should never have happened. And it's almost unbelievable that it does or has. And therefore, where do they go? Where do they go with this awful trauma?
Well, we are limited, and there's no two ways about that. There's a lack of service, but I mean, there's always been a lack of services for female victims. And I think the sad part for me is that as a society, we accept that women are victims or girls are victims. And I think, how can you accept that? You know, and then when it comes to male victims, it's that, you know, they'll get over it. Boys are tough and all that sort of thing. And so
Yeah.
that goes into your thinking, and the shame and the guilt and everything that goes with it. It's affected you literally affected who you are as a male, and then who you are as a man growing up. And that's why our prisons are so full, because these young boys are full of anger and hatred, and they've taken it out on society. And so being a man in New Zealand society was always being tough and staunch. So that's what these young fellas have tried to do, is be tough and staunch, and they end up in trouble. And nobody says, you know, when you're misbehaving when you're a little boy, you're constantly getting told off, instead of someone saying, you know, what's going on for you, and how can we help? And that's what's missing.
Yeah. I think it's that eternal question of what's happened to you?
Yeah,
Uh,
people are frightened to ask that. It's because, and I genuinely believe it's because if someone does say something, then what do I do with it? And it's
yes.
like, if your best friend or a friend discloses, and it can really scare you, especially if they say it was a parent or something like that. And because you've got no answers, you just want to shut down. Whereas in being able to say, well, that's horrible, that should never have happened here. Is there anything I can do? And they may just, honestly, some people just may need to talk,
Yeah.
and you just have to listen. And I think that people think if someone discloses, then that person has to fix it, and that's what frightens them. So they're better off just stepping away and thinking, I don't want to have anything to do with that.
Well, I think, and it's really useful information actually for our audience out there. If someone does you the honour actually of disclosing or sharing, all you are required to do is to listen.
And to be there.
And the power of that listening can actually give them confidence to maybe share that again with someone else.
Yeah. And, and,
So,
and, and there's like
mm,
everybody's at a different place in their lives too. Well, I mean, I had a guy ring me probably a few years ago, and he said, "Oh, Ken," he said, "I don't expect you to remember me." He said, "I was in the first group in 1997." And as he started talking, I recognised his voice, and I said, "Yeah, I do recognise you." And he said, "Oh," he said, "I saw you on telly last night getting interviewed, and this was about this the Maryland stuff." And he said, "It really triggered me." And he says, "I went straight back into that place." And he said, "And it was difficult because," he says, "I'm a successful businessman. I've got a beautiful wife and two beautiful kids." But he said, "I just went right back to that trauma as a 10-year-old boy."
yeah,
And he said, you know, so he said, "I realised that these things crop up." And I said, did you want to get back to counselling?" And he said, "No." I said, "Did you want to come back to the group?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, how can I help you?" He said, "You're there." He said, "Just knowing that I can
yeah,
pick up that phone." And so
yes,
that was the simple thing for him, just knowing that there was someone at the end of that phone who understood. And whereas
yes.
everyone says, "Oh, you've got to get back into counselling, or you've got to do this," and no, you don't. You do what sits with you at that moment in time.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really important. And as we know, how we all deal with that trauma can be different. Uh, One of the things I wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive into is we know there's limited and lack of services out there for all of us, male or female, survivors of child sexual abuse. How do you envisage, or what would be some useful resources, Ken, if you had the funding or had the support to do this? What would that look like?
Well, I think there has to be a national campaign. There needs to
Yeah,
be something out there that says hey, it's okay. You know, it's like the it's okay to talk thing, but it's okay. But then there has to be services for that when it's okay. That's the biggest thing. But I think, you know, uh, people like myself, a lot of men that have been through it and have now become successful in different ways in their lives need that opportunity to be out there, and so that others can look at that. Education's important. I mean, I've only ever been allowed to speak at 2 schools, and that was Shirley Boys High and Rangiora High, and that was only because of the people that I knew at those schools. But no other schools will allow us in there because that's and you think, what are they? What is the system frightened of that doesn't
Yeah.
want? And if you've got young boys sitting in a class listening, I mean, a female rape agency is allowed to go into a school and talk about this sort of stuff, but we're not as males allowed to go in and talk about it. It's kind of weird. So you've got young boys out there that don't even know that there's services available, and they'll be carrying the shame. And one of the interesting things too, Gloria, and it's probably I'm not sure how it is with female victims, but every man or young lad that I've worked with have sat there and said, I thought I was the only one. And so that's still going on today. And so if he thought he was the only one, so we think, well, hold on, the papers have been full of things, the articles come up, but they don't see those things. They miss that stuff. So I think there needs to be a national campaign. And I think it has to be, and for me, the biggest part about this work is about men and women working together.
Yes.
We can't, otherwise we're isolated, and men are put out to one side. So, and I do a lot of work with Louise Nicholas. We do a lot of work together, which is really powerful.
Yeah, and again, I'm shaking my head actually listening to you say that you've only ever been allowed or invited into 2 schools when we know police tell me that reports can be as much as 1 in 3, and I'm not just talking girls here. So if you consider those numbers, we're looking at well over 1 million people in New Zealand, and for those men of ours out there who are trying to come to terms with this, if we've got a systemic issue actually at government level where there's no permission or recognition or given to spread this far and wide, then of course the shame builds up, voices are shut down more, these men start to feel shame, and then I think you mentioned earlier, and then we see the results in prisons, or actually I have to say, a lot of suicide attempts being made.
Yeah, suicide's massive. I don't know what it is for female victims, but they say that it's 5 times more likely for men and boys to commit suicide who are victims of trauma than it is for the average male population.
Yeah.
So and also when you talk of, they've always said that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before their 16th birthdays. But then you think about the numbers that never disclose, or I'm not sure what it is for females, but what came out of the Royal Commission in Australia, it can take up to 33 years before a male will even disclose, and that's if they ever disclose. And so there's those things. And there was a conference in New Zealand at Auckland University, I think it was 1998, and it was called New Zealand's Untold Story, Male Victims of Sexual Trauma. And the research said that 64% of men who had been through the mental health system had been sexually abused in childhood, but only 4% of those men had ever spoken about it. And it wasn't until they were interviewed in a safe place that they discovered that 64, the figure was 64. So we've got all those things to think about as well.
It's interesting too for me that media coverage here is not widespread. There's no real interest, and unfortunately that just drives our fellow survivors underground more and more. And it's interesting because I call it the silent endemic, actually, and part of the reason you and I are talking today is so that we can actually have conversations like this, and hope that some other fellow survivors out there see this and realise, let's get this conversation going, let's get some attention, let's get a spotlight on this.
And
Uh,
the media is an interesting one, Laura, because it's sensationalised at the moment because of the Maryland's case and the Royal Commission, and so we've had 2 weeks where we've had bits and pieces in there, and then eventually that will just fade off.
yeah.
And so what happens is people lose it in their memories, and then they don't worry about it, and so and when if it's not in the newspaper or on the news, then it's not happening. So those are the things, and so media are really good at certain times of bringing this stuff out, but then the continuation of those stories is not good.
Well, it's interesting. I was meant to be on the AM show with Duncan Garner last year and talk about the book I'd written and my experience as a survivor of 16 years of child sexual abuse. And the date got pushed and pushed, and eventually I got phoned by a producer and told, actually, we've changed our minds. Our viewers don't want to see it, they don't want to hear it. There's no appetite. So my response was, that's fine, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen and it's not happening.
Yeah. And it's sad. I mean, they were trying to organise for me to be on the AM show early this week because of the Royal Commission, but that's never happened. And it's interesting because I did get Jack Tame interviewed me on the Breakfast Show a couple of years ago, and that was a really good article. And I have been on the Breakfast Show a few times, but it's sort of like, I think it depends who the editor is at the time. And I think they can pick and choose whether they want to. And it's the same as the media. It depends who the editors are or the sub-editors are at that time, and if that's not something that sits with them, then it doesn't get anywhere. And I remember we were nearly closing down a few years ago, and I contacted the newspaper and said, we're getting closed down. We've run out of money, and never heard from them. And I got angry, and I wrote this quite nasty email to the editor and said, look, whenever you've wanted anything in the paper and you've rung me, I've told you what you needed to know. If it's anything controversial, you'll say to me, do you believe it? And I said, and you would write that and quote me. But I said, now I'm asking for help. I said, you're not even interested. Within 5 minutes, I got a call from the editor to say a reporter would be contacting me. And then the next day, headlines in the paper, Male Survivor Agency closing down. And that's all we asked for in the first place, and they refused us. But we ended up getting the funding we needed because of the article in the paper.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, as you're talking, it makes me realise that there's another area of disparity. So for men and women survivors in this country, and it's this. You did a fabulous TED Talk. I saw it, so we'll talk a little bit about that shortly.
Thank you.
I have tried to get on TED Talk and share my story, but I think because there's so many women talking about similar things, there's no real interest. And I guess what I'm saying is it reminds me a little bit of the Me Too movement in this regard. Many, many women came forward and complained about what happened. Oh, well, they have to prove it, and it's not true. One man came forward, and suddenly it was believed.
Yeah, I know, it's bizarre.
So I think in that regard too, although we have male survivors who are never given permission to speak, I think there's also then the disparity between, but once you're believed, it's big, and it's allowed to be out there. For women survivors, no, you're just one in a line. And do you really need to talk about this?
Yeah, I know. It's so frustrating, and it's that. And one of the other things too that I often think about is Had I been an All Black, or in my boxing career, if I'd got to the Olympics, I would then have a platform to talk about this stuff.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
this All Black, or this Olympic boxing champion suffered sexual abuse in childhood, but when you're just an ordinary everyday citizen, it's like it doesn't matter,
No.
and so that's our society as well. We've got to that stage where it's got to be a bit Kim Kardashian type thing, and it's only the fact that several famous actors and actresses who stood up and started talking about this stuff that it actually got the traction that it really needed, and it sort of tells us a wee bit of how sick we are as a society.
Well, that's exactly the point. Unless you're someone who's got a huge following or you're famous for some reason, no one wants to know. Yet the reality is, if you pick 10 survivors in our country, their stories are
Yeah,
huge.
yeah.
So that's a nice little sideways manoeuvre from me. You're welcome. Into Ken, what's your kind of story? You're a survivor of child sexual abuse. What's kind of the story with that kind of age stage?
Yeah, I was, and one of the interesting things is I'm an oddity. Because I was abused by a stranger. The other thing is I've actually got the cutting out of the press newspaper in 1965, where Alan was convicted and sentenced to borstal training. So I've got proof that it happened to me. Whereas a lot of people don't have that. There was no witnesses. How do we know you're telling the truth and all that sort of thing? So I've got the cutting from the paper. So I know that it's true, and I know that it happened. The sad part about it is that it said a hospital orderly from Princess Margaret Hospital, Alan William Davey, was sentenced to borstal training for two charges of indecent assault on a 12-year-old boy. So he didn't indecently assault me, he raped me. And then over a period of time, he sexually abused me in different ways in different places. But they have to make it sound nice. Rape or sodomy is not, doesn't look good. So let's minimise the act as well as what happened. So I was 12 years old, very naive. Got picked had to go to the Princess Margaret Hospital. My mum was in hospital, and I took the bag of goodies in, and here he was. I didn't know really, he was following me around. We got to the bus stop, and the next minute we're in a public toilet at a picture theatre in town, and I've got my trousers down, and he's indecently assaulting me there. And still, I look back and I think, how did I get into that place, and how did that happen? So, of course, the blame was put on me then straight away. And then over that period of time, he basically had full access to do whatever he wanted to me. And I must have started misbehaving at school because I think Mum picked up it. And I remember when I'm in the classroom, and this is how these people operate. I'm in the classroom, and the headmaster came in, and he said, "Oh, Ken, you want it on my phone. It's your uncle. Apparently, it's a family incident." So I go into the headmaster's office and I go, "Hello," and it's Alan. And he says, "Hi." He says, "What are you doing after school?" And the headmaster's standing there. And I must have had a look at a shock on my face. And he said, here's a prime opportunity for me to say something, and I couldn't. And the headmaster was lovely, and so I hang up, and I don't even remember what I said to the headmaster, but obviously it would have been lies. And so all of a sudden you're caught up in this place where you're lying for what happened to you, and so you carry on in that persona, so you become another person than who you really are, and that's who I become. And then I started getting angry, lashing out. I got expelled from high school at 14 for assaulting a teacher and a prefect. I ended up getting locked up for knocking over a couple of policemen. Violence and just become that. And anybody in a place of authority or a position of power and I couldn't understand what was going on in my head. It was just it was crazy. Of course, alcohol came in at a very early age, at 12, after this happened. So that was my comfort. And it wasn't until I was in the army, and they had a propaganda movie about heroin and marijuana in '72. We didn't know anything about that stuff. So as soon as I saw that propaganda movie and it said what this stuff can do to your brain, I thought, oh, I'm in. So the weekend I got out of the army, a mate turned up with some opium. So I had so opium. Then the following week it was LSD, and then it was what we called Buddha, which was marijuana back in the 70s. It was pretty potent stuff. So that became part of my life. It was about getting away from what people would call the real world, just to get away from it, kill that pain. Suicide was always on my mind. It never left me. I was worthless and useless, and so that was just a continuation of who I was as a wee boy growing up.
Yeah. The and really grateful to you for sharing this, because I think, how courageous were you actually to find ways to survive this. And even though we look back and we can see, some of our behaviours weren't healthy, we were lying, we were, you know, um, not being honest with people about what was happening or how we were dealing with it, the drug use, etc. But you know what? Honour yourself for the fact that it gave you something and it gave you a way through.
Yeah,
So
thanks.
congratulations on that. I think sometimes we can spend our lives regretting not just what happened, but what we did to cope. And I just want to put a different lens on it and say, weren't we amazing actually, and weren't you? That actually what you chose helped you to get to where you are today.
Yeah, I think that the hardest part for me, and especially as a male, was the violence,
Yeah.
because those people at the other end of that violence weren't responsible for what happened to them, and so that's a lot of the that's a lot of the shame that's sometimes being carried about those people that have been hurt along the way. And yeah, they were survival mechanisms, and they weren't healthy survival mechanisms. And the violence, of course, was because I wanted to be seen as tough and strong.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
didn't want anybody to think that I was weak, and I certainly didn't want anybody to know what had happened.
No.
So that was that's probably the hardest part. And you're right. I've looked back over the years and thought, wow, to go through that and to get where I am now is pretty huge. And that's it's one hell of an apprenticeship,
It's
in a lot
amazing.
of ways. And it's and I suppose my dream and my goal has been that the same as all the men that I listened to over the time of the Royal Commission, each and every one of those men, the thing that they said to the judge was, I don't want this to happen to anybody else. And that's the most powerful thing that I think's come out of the work that I've done, is every man I've worked with has said, I don't want another boy to go through what I've been through. And those are the things that society needs here, in the position of people in power who can make a difference.
Yes. And it's absolutely correct. I think you mentioned shame earlier, and I think that's really powerful in shutting people down, because society doesn't really want to hear about it.
No,
So where there's no real appetite to hear about it, therefore it's not really happening. So, unlike rugby, which is constantly happening and we're hearing about it 24/7, and therefore it gets support and sponsorship and people behind it. This is seen as, potentially the elephant in the room, or put it away, no one wants to look. So I guess if you extrapolate that out, Ken, what you then have is individuals who see and hear and actually get quite strongly that's the message. Don't talk about it because no one's too interested. It's not that they don't care, it's just they'd rather not know, thanks. And, oh, what time's the game?
Yeah. I think, it is in the too hard basket.
Yeah.
If you haven't experienced this trauma and then someone's explaining it to you and your brain just can't comprehend that. And I've often said, especially with the Maryland stuff, is that the stories I've heard from those boys, because that's what they were at the time, are like something straight out of a Stephen King novel. I mean, some of the things that was done to them and that they had to do are just horrendous. That a human being wearing the collar of God would be doing those things to a child. And so for us working with these guys, it's difficult. But for somebody, especially people who have got strong religious beliefs, there's no way that they can even buy into or listen to this stuff. And so that just adds to the trauma, really.
Yes, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And I guess we have to find a way to have people feel more comfortable with this.
Mm.
I think otherwise we always end up being underground and, some of our survivors, especially men, feel shame and then the last thing they want is to feel pity.
Yes, and that's the hardest thing.
Yeah.
It's right. I just come off radiation for prostate cancer and finished that radiation on the 5th of January, and it was really interesting because growing up, I would have wanted to tell people that I had cancer or whatever, because I would have wanted the sympathy. Would want people to cuddle me and say, that little boy wanting that love and attention. And yet, when this happened to me just before Christmas, I didn't want to tell anyone, not because I didn't want anybody to know, but I didn't want anybody to feel sorry for me. It was kind of weird. It was the complete opposite of when I was growing up, because I think that's one of the things that that a lot of survivors miss is that affection, that being, it's not your fault, son. That should never have happened to you, and get that cuddle and that intimate closeness with people, because we struggle with intimacy because we couldn't tell the difference between intimacy and sex, because sex happened to us and the person said that they loved us at the time. So we believe that would, if you didn't have sex with someone, then they didn't love you. So it completely confuses your emotional connections to other human beings. And,
Absolutely. And I think too, it also creates a confusion because remember, this is happening as we are children. We don't actually have the cognitive ability to recognise or fully understand what's going on. And you made a comment earlier about, gosh, how did I get here? And I think it's that dissociation, it's that feeling of what's actually happening. And it's also this huge boundary issue because I know for me, through my struggle in overcoming all of this, Ken, boundaries were huge. And what it meant, it wasn't just in sexuality or intimacy, it was also in allowing people to take advantage of me in other ways or not saying no to things I didn't actually want to attend.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you don't want to upset people, so we become people pleasers, and then we end up hating ourselves for being people pleasers. And that's a constant. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's quite a few, I think, hallmarks of child survivors of child sexual abuse experience, and we all understand it and recognise it. I wanted to ask you as well, can you talk us through your TED talk and what led to that, and how that experience was for you. I know we're going back a few years now.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's still as clear in my mind. I got quite a shock actually. I got a ring from a person, and he said, "Would you be interested in doing a TED talk?" And I didn't know about TED talks at that time. And I said, and he explained what it was, and so he said, "Would you be interested?" Someone had given him my name, and the person who'd given him my name says, if you don't get him on TED Talk, I'll never talk to you again. So he was precious. So and it was really interesting because I'd done Toastmasters because I needed to learn how to, because I used to get really angry if people couldn't understand what I was saying, and I'd get angry. And so I went to Toastmasters to learn how to better articulate myself when I was putting in it. So these TED Talk people came along, and you have to do a whole different training. And it was 6 weeks full on with this person who would coach you through. And I told him what I wanted to talk about and how I wanted to talk about it, and they broke it down into sections for me, because you only get 18 minutes. And as you know, sometimes us survivors are good at going off track for 3 or 4 hours. So 18 minutes was good. And it was in Queenstown, and it was just it was the most incredible experience. We got picked up at the airport. A Mercedes took us to a hotel. We had a big barbecue that night and a big open fire outside in Queenstown. And then the next night we shifted into the Chalet, which is a pretty flash hotel, and there was a box of chocolate bickies on the pillow, and a little box of chocolates, and a dressing gown and slippers, and it was like being in a movie. It was unreal. And then we did practice, and then did the TED talk, and I think there were about 350 people there. And I think the biggest thing for me is I got a standing ovation, and it was kind of wow. It was and once again, as a survivor, you really struggle to get those people to say, when they say nice things about you or do nice things, because you think, God, are they going to take advantage of me, or what are they going to get out of this? So it was pretty humbling. But I met some incredible people. There were I think there were eight speakers altogether, and then afterwards we had a barbecue, and the people stayed. I had so many young people come up to me and say, thank you for talking about that stuff, and especially young men coming up and saying, thank you for doing that.
So, and I watched it and I saw your standing ovation. It was very humbling, wasn't it? It was wonderful and well deserved. I guess I'm interested, after that and as a result of that, did you find that there was more interest in what you were doing, in terms of your job?
It was, but once again, it's like the news. It's big for a week, and then it's gone. So that was the difficult thing. Once again, for me, and you're on a wee bit of a high as well.
Yeah,
people saying nice things to you, and I think it got up to 10,000 views or something. So that was a buzz. But I'd like those 10,000 people. I hope they send it out to another 10. That sort of thing. That was the sort of thing I would like to see.
I knew that you had wanted that, and I could see that, and I was really hoping, that would spread, and people would then get the support, because the whole focus is to actually shine light on this so that people can be helped. And and if we can do that, that's so key. Tell me a little bit about the you talked about your mum back when she was in hospital and you were 12. As you grew up, were you ever able to tell her or your family what had happened?
Well, Mum was in the police station. What happened was outside the Papanui police station, and and I was with Alan. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was shining. He's sitting there, and I'm sitting. This is when you look back, you think, how bizarre is this?
Yeah.
We're sitting there like bloody old buddies, sort of thing. Here's a guy that's sexually violating me, and I'm seeing him as my best friend. It's it's sort of that in itself is just even hard to get my own head around. And these two police cars pulled up, and one got out and said, "Are you Kenneth Clearwater?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Would you like?" And he was nice, and he said, "Wanted to come for a drive with us." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I got in the back seat, and then I just heard the other cop say, "You get in the other car." And so Ellen got in the other car behind me, went, and we got back to the police station. My mum was there, and it was kind of weird, and I sat there, and of course I'm feeling shameful. It's just here's my mum, and I'm in the police station, and I'm in the wrong, of course, because that's what I was told. I still struggle to come to terms with. The cop was amazing, and if you think back in 1965, they had no training.
No.
But he was really lovely, and he asked me some weird questions that I honestly couldn't answer because I didn't have words for sodomy, I didn't have words for semen, I didn't have words for oral sex, all that sort of stuff. So I was sort of
Confused?
completely confused. And he said to me at one stage, he said, "Did he do to you what a man would do to a little girl?" Now, I didn't know what men did to little girls, but the cop was so nice, I didn't want to upset him. And I said, "Yes." And I look back and think that's weird. But in reality, he did do those things to me. And then there was a knock on the door, and the other cop poked his head through the door and said, "Oh, you don't have to question the boy anymore. He's confessed to everything." And of course, I didn't know what confess to everything meant. And so the cop just said, "Oh, you guys can go now, and he'll be going to court." And that was it. So I went home, and it was never ever discussed again from that moment on. My mum didn't know how to deal with it. She was always, and I mean, I'm just grateful I had a mum and a family, mum and a dad and a family, which and it didn't happen within that content. So or context. So therefore, I wasn't facing the abuser every day, and so that was it. And then I got home from school, and Mum said, "Oh, have you got a minute?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "The police have just run." She said, "Alan's escaped with another dangerous criminal." So that, you've got no idea where that put me.
Oh.
I was, because I was responsible for him going to prison, so therefore he was going to come back and get me. And I was terrified. I couldn't sleep. Every noise I heard, it was him. Every time the phone rang, I'd freeze, and then I'd go to school. So that's when I started making sure that I had a whole bunch of other people around me. Because I'd walk down the street, and if someone walked out of a shop, I'd think I'd go bang because it would be him, but it wasn't. And this was constant in my life. I'd go somewhere, and he was always there, and he wasn't, but that's what I saw, and so that was a constant. And then the police rang and said he'd been arrested and he was put back in. So, but it didn't stop that psychological damage.
Huge damage, and you've raised a couple of things. There's clearly, as we would expect, post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And, of course you're going to imagine it's him because he was that bogeyman or that abuser and aggressor coming up from nowhere and confronting you. The other thing you raise, which I think is really useful for our audience out there, Ken, is, I'm using different words, but you were groomed. Of course, you were made to feel special until you were then being used for the purpose he intended. And it's at that point, children, and all children do this, we make ourselves bad and wrong.
yeah.
And we do that because that's just what children do. Where there's an adult or child, the child will always take on that blame and take on that shame.
And of course, I had no idea about grooming, or that I had been groomed. And I
Mm.
ended up, when I started doing this work, I did a workshop, and I'm sitting there, and this guy started talking about this, and I thought, "Holy shit, that's what happened to me," And
Yeah.
even as an adult, I hadn't understood that until that person had said it. And then I think I can't remember when I got expelled from school at 14. My dad got me a job at his work. Now, this part, I don't remember whether I was at work or whether I was still at school. So I was still only probably maybe 13 or 14 at the time. And there was a competition on the radio, and it was Ovation is the best in the nation. And if you answered the phone and said Ovation is the best in the nation, you got, like, I think it was $20 worth of products. And there's 9 of us in the family, and then whenever the phone went, whenever it was, you could hear a stampede throughout the house. And one day, my bedroom, the phone was right outside my bedroom, and mum's and dad's bedroom was next door, and the phone rang. So I walked out, and I forgot to say Ovation is the best in the nation. And I said, hello. And he said, oh, hi, Ken. He said, I've just been released. You want to catch up? And I just froze, and my hand was frozen to the phone. My mum had walked out at exactly the same time to answer the phone, and she could see the look on my face. And she said, "Is that him?" And I couldn't speak, and I just nodded. And he says, "Oh, I better go." And he hung up. And mum had to take the phone out of my hand. It was really, my hand was frozen. Went back into my room, and I was just numb. I was just So here he was. He's out. He's now out and knows where I live. And I go through that whole trauma again of what happened to me. And I honestly, and I look back, and even for many years, once as I was talking about before, the phone rings, I jump, you know. I just love the fact now we've got caller ID. It just makes a huge difference. But just the fact that that's embedded in my brain cells.
There's certainly lots of things that stay with us as survivors, and one of them are those triggers. And I think too, people who perhaps haven't gone through trauma like this don't always recognise just how powerful they can be. And yeah, it's huge, and it's very real, and it has the capacity actually to take us straight back in time to that very moment,
Yeah, yeah.
whether we wish it to or not. So yeah, it's
That is
tough.
painful. That's painful.
Yeah. Is there anything you would like to say to our wonderful men out there who are trying so hard to overcome this trauma? Is there anything you would like to say to them or offer them actually
Well,
as some
well,
ideas to manage what they're going through?
yeah, I always hate to say it. It's important to talk because if there's no one to talk to, then that makes it difficult. But I mean, I think that the only thing we can heal properly is by opening ourselves up. But when you open yourself up and you're vulnerable, you need to be doing that in a safe environment. I think that's really important. And if you're going to talk to someone, it's important that you talk to someone that you know and trust. Look, I just, I would never have, if people said, "Oh, you need to talk about," I wouldn't have. And it wasn't until I realised that I needed to go, and that's when I ended up in the mental health system, which failed me, and it's still failing many survivors. But I think if you just need someone to talk to, and also it's about and finding out what help is available. And it can take ages. It took me a long time before I went to the court, found the male survivor peer support group back in in '96, but when I found it, and it was just the most powerful thing I could do, to be able to sit with other men who had experienced similar to what I, and all our journeys are different, but the effects are similar.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
that's the part that we don't work so much on our story. We work on the effects of what the damage had been done. So yeah, if you're able to talk to someone, that's really important. Someone that you know and you trust, and don't be frightened to have a look at what's available. And what's around. Reading books. I found I was never a book reader, but I found once I started reading books about people who have travelled these journeys, it made a huge difference. And there's a book out there called Victims No Longer. It was written by an American anthropologist
Yes.
who was a therapist in Boston by the name of Mike Lew. It was written in 1988. It was the first book ever written for and about male survivors, and I think that's a huge one.
Yes. Funny you say that. I've just been reading that.
Right.
Yeah, very powerful.
So I've had a lot to do with Mike over the years. We're still really good buddies, and he's been out to New Zealand. He was if it wasn't him, I wouldn't have got to go to the international conferences that I've attended. So yeah, so if you get a chance to read it, that's definitely the book to read. But yeah, don't be frightened to seek help. It's really important.
Yes,
and we're worth it.
Of course we are. We could have an ad.
Yeah,
We could have an ad. But yes, so for all you fellow survivors out there, clearly you're not alone. You never have been. We stand beside you, and we have lots of other people as well. There's a lot of us here in New Zealand, and we're working hard to try and get more support and resource out there. And people like Ken are doing a fantastic job. And we're looking actually to have more males on the show. So if you are comfortable to do so, please reach out. And you can go to gloriamasters.com, and there's an online form for you to complete. But just as we're ending, just stay on the line there, Ken. I just would want to thank Ken very much for his wisdom and his insight, and also for the fantastic job he's doing for us here in New Zealand. It's very humbling and so appreciated by many people.
Thanks, Gloria. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. So, look, fellow survivors out there, please feel free to subscribe and share this feed. The more survivors out there that can be heard, the more empowered they can be. This is handing the shame back. Every time we speak to someone, we are handing the shame back more and more. I do write lots of uplifting content, and you're very welcome to go and look at that on gloriamasters.com. And I think for all of us out there, be proud. We're amazing. We did it, and we're here today to talk about it. So all the best to everybody out there. And I thank you